What does British science have to look like after Brexit?
I think we've just got to be brave enough to say horrendous mistakes were made.
They will never blanketly support waiving of visas.
And this is where I think referendums can get very dangerous. Welcome to The Table, a new discussion show from Byline TV, where we aim to have a productive debate about the things that matter, with people we might not always agree with. But this isn't just any other talk show. At The Table, there's no hiding behind sound bites or slogans. We are going straight to the heart of the issues that matter. And we'll be diving deep into the philosophical and cultural underpinnings behind our positions. Here, every position must be justified and no topic is off the table. At The Table tonight, we have co-founder of Scientists for EU and media commentator Mike Galsworthy, businessman, Reform UK and former Brexit Party politician Richard Tice, journalist, writer and commentator Afua Hagan, and me steering you all through it as your host, Marina Perkis. Tonight, it is a big Brexit special. We are now 6 years on from the referendum and 2.5 years on from leaving the EU after much discussion, debate and stalemate. But what do we have to show for it? In the last week alone, we've learnt that the UK's Brexit divorce bill is at a 42.5 billion and rising still. As well as that, the EU is launching fresh legal action against the UK government for breaking the Northern Ireland Protocol. And just this week, we've seen even more border chaos at Dover, where insiders have told Byline TV it's definitely down to Brexit. So, are Brits having buyer's remorse? YouGov's latest poll found 54% of the British public think Brexit is going badly. And an Ipsos UK poll found almost half of Britons say Brexit has made their daily life worse. It's not feeling much like the sunlit uplands that we were promised. So what is really going on? Let's get straight into it. Was Brexit doomed from the start, or is the problem simply in its implementation? Should we start with you, Mike?
Was Brexit doomed from the start? Well, as a Remainer, I always thought that it was not the best choice, not the best option. But any union worth its salt, any club worth its salt has to have free, passage out for those that want to get out, and it's a learning experience for us and for the EU to have a country sort of go through that. Our situation is more complicated because of Northern Ireland, where you actually have an overlap of nations. For any other country, it would be simpler. I think that obviously Brexit could have been done better. Immediately after the referendum vote, when we all had to, kneel before Zod and say that we respect the result, one of the first things that I was doing was, with others, writing plans for how do you make science work, given the Brexit vote, or how do you make the whole situation work? And for us, the obvious solution was, when you've got, 16 million versus 17 million, a tight result, how do you take a step that honours the result, but then also feels like it would be acceptable to the broad demographic? And that would have been in the single market. Maybe the UK is a third pillar in the single market alongside the EU, alongside EFTA. So you're out of the common fisheries policy, you're out of the common agricultural policy, but you're still retaining a lot of those market structures. And then, of course, you have negotiations around sort of free movement and rules of that. That's where we thought it was going to go. But then the Lancaster House speech pulled it right away to no overlap whatsoever, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, European Court of Justice. We're going for the hardcore separation because we fear that it might be, anything wishy-washy. And I think that sets everything down much more hostile and destructive path, and particularly when you are dealing with Northern Ireland, the government has picked a solution that it wasn't honest and open about, and they are now in blood stepped so far that they're determined to go on making things worse rather than actually starting working with the EU.
I think, to your point, actually, some people are saying we haven't Brexited hard enough, and that's why it's not working. Are you of that school of thought, Richard?
Look, it's a huge platform of opportunity. I never, ever have a moment of doubt about that. But there's no question that this government, who I've been very critical of, have utterly failed to take advantage of what I believe is a platform of opportunity. They haven't started to deregulate. They haven't started to cut taxes. A simple thing that actually even people on the left quite rightly are saying the government should be doing, cutting VAT on energy bills, which Brexit allows and you couldn't do as a member of the EU. The government's chosen not to.
We absolutely could. That's false. We absolutely could do it. Why do we have member states then, who are now part of the EU, lowering VAT on energy bills?
Well, my understanding has always been you couldn't do that. And that was one of the things. It was one of the things that was talked about during the campaign. And they haven't done that. And, they just haven't deregulated. I always felt that this is about a growth opportunity, that we should be going for growth, that essentially the EU is holding back growth, and they just haven't done that. And yes, you can blame COVID for a bit, but we're way beyond that. For me, the opportunity is a great one. There are certain things that we've actually benefited from that I know some people will disagree with, for example, the vaccine rollout. But the reality is they just haven't done it properly. And my simple view is if you're going to do a job, any job, do it properly.
Afua, before I come to you, I just want to pick up on one of Richard's points about deregulation, because it's painted as the holy grail of this is the advantage, this is the opportunity we're not taking advantage of. The more we deregulate, the more we are going to face barriers when we try to import with other countries. So what is it you think? How do you think deregulation is going to help this
massively
mess that we're in?
First of all, much of what we do is within the UK. All our domestic businesses are facing unnecessary bureaucracy and hurdles and barriers that we should that's a cost to business, so it restricts growth. And, the EU, our trade with the EU is a certain percentage. It's around, give or take, sort of 10% we're exporting lots elsewhere in the world, for example, to the US or whatever. And you've got these barriers to entry. So you've got to cut cost to business, which means that you're not wasting money. You get higher growth, which means you can pay higher wages. And if you get higher wages, then you get higher tax revenues. These are the things that other nations do better than ourselves. And that was one of the opportunities that this government hasn't done. But
all we're going to do there is impose a system where there are two tiers of regulation.
But that's what we have with every other country around the world. That's how individual trading nations work.
But not with our largest trading partner.
Our single biggest trading partner, single biggest trading nation is the United States. And we don't have a trading deal with them. So, the reality is you can trade with other nations. You don't have to be part of a huge bureaucratic trading bloc in order to actually trade very successfully. Because fundamentally, businesses will look to trade where they can trade profitably with other people.
Question is, with deregulation, what is it that you would like to deregulate? What are the first things? What are your top five? What's on your list? Should you get into power? This is Richard Tice, numbers 1 to 5.
Many of your viewers will say, please, God, no, don't let it happen. There are multiple things, and there's a cumulative effect. But simple little things that annoy, I think, most people. Like the GDPR thing, the little allow cookie or reject the settings on the cookie on your computer. It's nuts. It's such a waste of time. It's a real bore.
So that's number one. Number two.
I'm not doing it in an order, Mike. Okay. I'm doing it in just small examples, right?
But it's funny that you reached for that as an example. It's a bit like Jacob Rees-Mogg. It's a bit like Jacob Rees-Mogg talking about the numbers in the Dartford Tunnel.
But
why don't you reach?
One.
No, we want big. That's not going to compel anyone. So give us a really good deregulation reason.
Every single hour.
That GDPR actually protects people so that people don't end up having their mailboxes spammed.
Exactly. So you do it simply for big businesses so that they don't spam people. That is completely different. So it's about coming up with
it's about data privacy as well.
So in my business, in the world of construction, for example, EU procurement rules are massively, massively burdensome on bidding contracts, which meant that the price of the bidding went up and therefore the price of the overall contract went up. That's another simple example of where actually EU regulations in the industry that I work at is a real block and just adds unnecessarily to costs.
And I would actually say regulation in that sort of industry, if we look at things like Grenfell Tower, for example, I don't know how many people would feel comfortable watering down those regulations further, given what was allowed to happen.
But actually, hang on. But the whole point, that was because of incompetence, utter incompetence. And of course, that tragically happened when we were still a member of the EU. And it did involve all sorts of businesses.
But I don't think further regulation is going to save us from that.
It's about smart regulation, not daft regulation. There are far too many daft EU regulations. What happened with the Grenfell thing, and I'm very close to it, is that essentially we're one of only 2 countries that allowed that cladding to be put on buildings above 18 metres high. It was utter incompetence from civil servants. The only other country was the UAE, but because most of their buildings are new and they've got sprinkler systems, even when they've had a horrific fire of a skyscraper, actually, no one's died because of the sprinkler system. So, again, that was incompetence rather than the regulation itself.
OK, moving on to you. What are your thoughts?
I think when it comes to whether Brexit has been a success or not, whether it's delivering what it's supposed to, I think because actually the mandate was delivered on such a tight margin that we are essentially getting what a lot of people, a lot of Brexiteers would say is a Remainers Brexit. So I agree with you when you say that it isn't hardline enough, that David Frost failed to deliver what a lot of Brexiteers wanted, which was, for us to completely cut ties, for us to completely deregulate, for us to completely become essentially our own island. So therefore, a lot of people saying it's a Remainers Brexit. Now, I was a Remainer. I did not vote for the Brexit mandate. I don't think we're getting a Remainers Brexit. What we are getting is a government who are not hardline enough and not tough enough to deliver what they promised. Unfortunately, the majority of people in this country. And I kind of feel like if you're going to do something, do it properly or don't do it at all. And we're in a situation where we have some parts of Brexit being delivered and some not. When Liz Truss is talking about what she's going to do if she becomes Prime Minister, her thing about is just throwing out all these EU regulations and laws, letting them expire when it comes to the end of 2023, all these rights that we have under the EU, just getting rid of them. That's what Brexiteers want. And so when you ask the question, has it been a success or a failure? I mean, to me, it's been a failure because we never should have had Brexit in the first place, and it's been a failure because hardline Brexiteers haven't got what they wanted either.
But do you think, just stepping in there, so this sort of bonfire that we keep hearing about of EU regulations, do you think the average voter will understand what the implications of that will be? And you'll be closer to this, Mike, but because there are going to be all sorts of political costs, economic, all sorts of costs that I think people just think it's a very easy thing to do. But actually, we will become even more of a pariah state. We are trying to be global, and all that will do is shut us down.
I mean, a prime example of that is what has happened at Dover. So lots of people we want tighter borders, less people coming into our country, Britain for Britons and all that. You're not realising that when you're going on holiday, you're now potentially going to need a visa. You're now potentially going to be
You don't need a visa to go to the EU.
No, I said potentially. And you're going to be in hefty queues when you want to return to the country. There'll be nobody in that EU passport
so
queue.
there's no queues
and now
at
there's the
Southampton.
other passport queue, and you're going to be in that one. Simple things that people didn't think about. People that were living abroad in places like Spain and France, all of a sudden, we can't just live there now. You have to come back home or get a visa or apply to stay there. These are the simple things that when we have that bonfire, so to speak, when all those, if Liz Truss becomes PM and she gets rid of all those rights into 2023, these are little things that people haven't considered that are going to make their lives more difficult. But at the end of the day, you voted for them. So
let's quickly deal with the Dover thing, okay? Right? You had issues at Dover which were always highlighted in the various newspapers in 2012, 13, 15, 16. We've got all the pictures of the newspapers. Look, the reality is, it was at Dover because...
I saw your tweet, Richard. Now, you're being a little bit misleading there, because you were talking about situations which cause chaos at the border, caused by things like strikes.
Yeah, and this is caused by French border force not turning up for work.
No,
there were 10
wasn't,
booths
wasn't they
and
didn't
only
turn
4
up.
rocked up.
Richard, it wasn't that they didn't turn
why
up.
weren't the queues at Southampton? Why weren't the queues at Portsmouth? Why weren't the queues
are
at Harwich
spreading now
or Felixstowe?
because the ports that we're talking about, Dover, and the other one is, what's the other one? Folkestone is now. So Dover, they're trying to get under control now.
Folkestone's the Eurotunnel.
Folkestone is about to be the next Dover. So they are the more heavily populated in terms of holiday makers and the fact that it's on the school holidays.
It's always a bottleneck. It's always busy. It's always busy, and it was busy before Brexit, and it's busy after Brexit. But if the people don't turn up for work and they built extra passport booths,
that's not accurate.
It's true. They built 10 passport booths, right? And they had agreed working plans between the respective border force people, and they didn't show up for work. It's as simple as that.
Where have you got this from?
Where have I got this from?
Who's your pal at border force?
Well, funnily enough, I've been reading the newspapers and I've been speaking to people.
Which ones?
I spoke, for example, yesterday, just a couple of days ago, I spoke to someone from the port agency who clarified all of this information for me. So the information is there. There's no doubt at all. Everyone accepts that people didn't rock up for work, and that's the reality. And you've got to remember also that the Le Touquet agreement means that at Dover, the French border force are this side of the channel, whereas in all the other ports, they're not. They're on the French side.
OK, so in 2020, the French government foresaw these issues because of our departure from the EU. They actually said to our government, they wanted 33 million to fund the extra checks. And there are extra checks, right? So it used to be everyone's just waved through, and now they have the checking of passports. There's a stamping.
I want to know who's coming in and who's going out.
We need to make sure. That is a lot of checking. There's also we have to check that they are not outstaying there 90 days within 880 for and if you've got a car full of people, that's 4 people's passports. You've also got articulated lorries, you've got ferries, this isn't just like any other port.
And there was a lorry driver on the radio this morning that goes across every week and has done for the last 18 months, who confirmed that it had not been an issue until this weekend at any time in the last 18 months.
So what's going on at Kent?
So what's going on is that it's a busy period and the blokes didn't rock up. And that point about the 2020, when they asked for more booths, they got more booths. They built more booths. There were 10 booths as opposed to what there were 5 or 6 beforehand. So it has happened that folks didn't rock up. And you've got the chaos that ensued.
Right. And what I do wonder about how that impacts the lorry queue as well, the Kent car park. Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, we used to have agreements to ensure that the flow of goods and people was as minimal as possible, and that's built up over years and years and years. And so we now have had a structural change. Are the structural changes surmountable? Well, it takes more staff, it takes more effort, we will see. Certainly in the movement of goods out and in, we've seen lots and lots of problems there, to the point whereby we're still in a grace period for our import checks because our government don't have the structure set up in order to take those in, because it was going to be very damaging to do so. And that also would be inflationary. So there's problems with the free movement of individual people and goods and money and lots of other things that we used to have agreements to make easier. And some of these will be easier to deal with than others, and there will be busy periods and there will be sectors that get hit more. Richard may be happy that all these checks are happening, but
a lot of the checks next
not.
year are going to be electronic. So there's a new system coming in next year called ETIAS, which stands for, I think, European Travel Information Authorization System, if I've got it, which is a bit like the US ESTA system. And that's going to make a lot of this electronic. And so, yes, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, this would have all happened simultaneously, but it hasn't. And so a bit of patience is required.
Why do you think the UK government has suspended checks? So they've extended the transition again, that Jacob Rees-Mogg has extended the transition period because he doesn't want checks. Why is that?
Yeah, I think very simply because the civil service, frankly, haven't got their act together. But there's a real question, actually, again, you can be selective about which checks you need to apply. If you have trusted trader schemes, if you have authorised economic operators, you don't need to do the checks because it's all electronic. Most of the declarations are electronic, and the companies that you trust and you know over a long period of time, they don't need the checks at all. That's what used to happen, and that's what still happens, and that's what should always happen.
It feels like a lot of solutions that maybe should have been worked out prior to actually leaving.
Correct, absolutely right. No, they should be worked out.
And also that require good faith on both sides.
And they failed to do.
One thing I want to touch upon is you are obviously a very pro-growth, low-tax man.
Yep.
How do you marry that with the fact that this Brexit has absolutely hammered GDP by 4%, which cost the taxpayer
it hasn't hammered
billions.
4%. That's a forecast. It hasn't yet hammered it.
Due to forecast. Has hammered exports by 15% for imports and exports together.
Our exports, it's really important to get these figures right, Marina.
No, and I've got them here. I can quote them from the OBR and the OECD. Where are yours from?
Mine are from the ONS, okay, and our exports to the EU monthly in April 22 are higher than 3 years prior in April 2019. So actually, in terms of exports to EU, we're ahead of where we were 3 years ago. That's good news.
I don't know how on earth
How happy are our exporters, though? Because that has been polled as well. And our exporters are unhappy with the current situation. Partly because UK exporters now have to have checks and paperwork wherever they want to send it, whereas their competitors in Europe don't have those checks on their exports anywhere else around Europe, including the UK at the moment.
Most of the checks.
So as a competitive
electronic.
disadvantage, Richard, this is huge.
It's not huge.
It is huge.
These are electronic declarations that most exporters are used to doing if they export elsewhere in the world. It's part of doing business.
But why are they doing reams of paperwork? Why have they got reams
It's not
of paperwork?
It's electronic declarations.
Whether
It's electronic paperwork rather than physical paperwork. Either way, it's barriers. It's barriers that we didn't used to have. We didn't used to export to the EU. We just used to transport elsewhere in the EU.
Because we're exporting more to the EU than we were 3 years ago.
I think you might cherry pick a month that looks good.
No,
whereas
it's
the rest
consistent.
Of the months...
It was the same in December 18 compared to December 2021. Okay?
Very different.
Very happy to show you the graph.
I've got £100 billion in lost
It's the
output.
counterfactual that you compare to, which is where we would be if we were still in the EU without all of those forms, without the billions of extra costs.
If we'd still been in the EU,
the barriers.
If we'd still been in the EU, we would have had a slower vaccine rollout. More people would literally have
not
died
true.
of
This has
COVID.
been proven many times.
Every other nation across the whole of the EU relied on the EU's procurement programme for vaccines, and they had a delayed vaccine rollout programme, which means more people sadly died. One of the extraordinary benefits of Brexit
Richard.
that
This has
actually
been disproven many
has been
times.
disproven. It's a question of fact.
Richard.
Germany and the Netherlands wanted to do their own procurement plan. They were bullied into going down the Brussels procurement plan. As a result, they had a slower rollout, and more people sadly died.
No, that's not the first.
Absolutely true, Mike.
Richard.
You know it.
No, the first vaccine that we got going on was the Pfizer one. So that was made in the EU, it was designed in the EU, it was funded by the European Investment Bank, it was tested in the EU, it was manufactured in the EU, and then shipped from the EU to us.
We ordered it first because we were able to order it ourselves.
We ordered AstraZeneca.
Right, we ordered AstraZeneca, but because we were doing our own procurement of the vaccines... No, I haven't confused anything, Mike.
AstraZeneca also because we jumped
We ordered between Pfizer and AstraZeneca.
No, look, the point is...
The first one was the Pfizer one, which was a pure EU one.
Vaccines as an individual sovereign nation,
yes,
and we were able to deliver them into people's arms earlier because we were doing it independently on our own. Whereas, unfortunately, the EU overall procurement programme was slower, and that meant to delays.
The EU actually ordered the AstraZeneca vaccines with their contract a day before the UK. And then the UK, when they did it a day later...
a month later to be delivered into people's arms?
Because what the UK government did is they said, you've just done a contract with the EU for these AstraZeneca vaccines. We now want to do a contract with you for these vaccines, and we're going to twist your arm and make sure that you supply us first until we are satisfied.
Brilliant. The joy of independence. We negotiated the contract quicker, we paid them quicker, and we got them into people's arms quicker, and people survived.
Nationalism. And if the EU had done the same thing to the UK, we would have been disempowered by a third of that traffic.
The EU was slower in negotiating the contract. It's just a question of fact. And that's one of the reasons why. Guess who invoked Article 16 in the Northern Ireland?
A day before.
Guess who invoked Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol? It was the EU. And then they had to withdraw it because they realised...
Yeah, within a few hours.
OK, let's move on to the next question because we're not going to resolve this here, sadly. What might happen under a new Conservative leader? So we've talked about how could someone make Brexit a success. Richard, you've talked about deregulating. What are your thoughts? Is there a way to make Brexit a success, Afua?
At this point, I think for Brexiteers, the only way to make Brexit a success is to go down the road of delivering everything that I guess was promised during campaigning. So, absolutely, all the deregulations Richard is talking about, definitely making the UK more of a sovereign state, more of an island, more of a pariah. That is what Brexiteers want. And I think
we're at the global top table.
When we talk about a new Prime Minister, so whether it's Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, they're going to have to deliver the Brexit that Brexiteers want, and not this quote-unquote Remainers Brexit, which is what we seem to have at the moment.
That might be a success in the eyes of Brexiteers who just, on the surface, like, look, we've ditched all of these laws. But that's on the surface. For anyone who is close to business, for example, who's close to economics, they will know that's going to spell disaster.
Oh, absolutely. It's absolutely going to spell disaster. But I think that, well, like we've talked about, the increased regulations when it comes to imports and exports. Yes, it might be electronic paperwork, but it's more paperwork. And also, remember, when people are buying things,
it's the same as what we do with other nations.
Paying higher delivery costs, things that affect everyday people, whether it's what we have available to buy at the supermarket and the prices of that, whether it's our energy prices, the cost of living crisis, all these things.
I'm very happy to talk about energy and why it's so much better to be outside the EU than suffer EU rationing of energy because of their foolishness about their dependency on Russia. Very happy to talk about that. Another benefit of Brexit.
All these things are related, right?
That's a national competence, not an international competence.
And it's
and I think that I've lost my train of thought. I think that yes, there's lots of people who didn't vote for Brexit, people who perhaps were on the fence, or people who are staunch Remainers. Everybody is going to be in a place where when we start deregulating, when we start seeing, perhaps rights stripped away, other, laws brought in, we're going to go by Supreme Court rulings here in the UK. There's things that are going to affect us negatively. And I actually think that the UK has got the mandate that it deserves. They say that a country elects a government that it deserves, and we have got what we deserve. And it's not going to be good. Don't get me wrong.
The reason I disagree with that is because I have faith in the British people. What I think was really sad is that they were really badly lied to.
Absolutely.
And they trusted their politicians and their politicians.
Because we in the United Kingdom, in a democratic state, we feel, or we used to feel, not so much anymore, but we used to feel we could trust our politicians. That if somebody is campaigning and has something written on a battle bus, then that is going to be the God's honest truth. But as we have seen in the past few years, especially when we have a Prime Minister that is absolutely just, made a mockery of the office of the Prime Minister, of public service, of what an MP, a Prime Minister, is supposed to do.
We can all agree.
Of course, we have lost faith in our politicians and lost faith in politics. There's a lot of people who are politically homeless at the moment.
Very much so.
Because, the Labour Party aren't delivering. The Liberal Democrats,
the opportunity
where
of
are
reform
they?
UK. You
the
see,
Green
that's the
Party
joy.
I don't think that's the solution,
Don't know if Reform
Richard.
UK are delivering.
It's definitely the solution, because with us you'll get lower taxes, less daft regulation, you'll get higher growth, higher wages, and reformed, better, faster public services.
Richard, just before we move on to the next question, I do struggle with this. You literally campaigned. The reason we've got higher taxes, one of the reasons we've got higher taxes
is because we had a tax and spend con-socialist chancellor called Rishi Sunak.
No, it's not. It's because...
Con-socialist, isn't
Yes, that's what I've invented it.
Let's not give it any platform. Oh, goodness me. So, say, for example, everyone's despairing at these Tories and we end up voting in a Labour government, Labour coalition government, perhaps.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Could or should they be reversing Brexit?
I mean, the chances of... First of all, the chances of the Labour Party in the state it's in now coming to power in my lifetime is nil. With Keir Starmer as a leader, it's not possible, right? So unless we have what can only be described as a revolution within the Labour Party to bring about some leadership that have a clue that on the day the Prime Minister is resigning, not getting the highlights done and going to Wimbledon, that are forward-thinking, that will stamp out anti-Semitism, will be more representative of the United Kingdom, given that all these things, a miracle happens, basically. I think if we have a Labour government, they should definitely look at repealing Brexit if they can. Now, Keir Starmer's already said that he won't do that. You know, there's some polls that have said if people were to go to the polls today and vote, that perhaps we wouldn't vote for Brexit. It wouldn't happen. And we've always said that this vote would be once in a generation. We've said the same thing about Scottish independence, which I know we're going to come to. And it looks like that's going to happen. But I think perhaps also, if we have a Labour government or any opposition government, it's a risk for them to campaign on, we will look at Brexit, because people are politically fatigued. You know, fed up of going to the polls, fed up of hearing about it,
Yeah,
you know?
agreed.
I think there's a lot of people who are like, we're here, get on with it.
Yeah, I think many of us are quite sick of the last however many years of just observing Tory infighting, bitching, power struggles, greed struggles.
Absolutely, which we're in the midst of
When you
right
talk
now.
about Labour power, you talk about a majority Labour government.
Yes.
Yes. I think because of what's going on in Scotland, which obviously you're very familiar with, I think it's almost impossible mathematically because the SNP is so powerful. You know, the Labour Party used to have, give or take, 45
they used to
MPs.
dominate
It's now got
Scotland.
1 or 2.
Yeah.
So unless that changes, then a majority of a Labour government, but a Labour-Lib coalition is, I think, is the hot favourite for the next general election. And the joy of that, which maybe is for a separate discussion, is the opportunity for proportional representation.
We are agreed.
Isn't that fantastic?
We are agreed on that.
Your preference would be for a Lib-Lab government rather than a Conservative.
My preference would be for for proportional representation, and the way to that is a Lib-Lab coalition. And look, I want this Conservative
Do you
government.
think-
I
you
despise
think they're
their
tired
incompetence.
and you think they should go?
I think they're incompetent. I think they're untrustworthy. And I
And
think
is that
in
just
that sense,
for you with Boris Johnson, or is it all? Or is it with the whole set of them?
I think,
Do you see that with
so
Liz
many
Truss
of
and
us
Rishi
are sick
Sunak?
of the absurd spectacle of cabinet ministers defending the obviously indefensible in
Yeah.
so many areas. And Afua quite rightly remembered about lies. You know, we used to trust our civil service, we used to trust our cabinet ministers,
Yeah.
and we used to trust our prime minister. And you ended up in a situation where you actually couldn't trust any of it.
And we used to have better quality debate, even from very different vantage points. Whereas I feel if Boris Johnson were at the table here, we would get nowhere
But I
in
also
terms
think-
of any agreement or sensible
We
discussion.
ask him to come on the next show.
You might have a bit of spare time.
He'd be too busy cosplaying some other ridiculous 14-year-old boy fantasy. So,
We've touched upon the next and the final question for the evening. So, what's this going to have? What impact is Brexit going to have on the case for Scottish independence? Because obviously the last independence referendum was 2014. There's been a litany of broken promises made to the Scots, and I understand completely why there's now a movement to leave. But what do you think? Moving to you, Mike, sorry.
well, for me, I mean, I'm a fan of teamwork. I'm a fan of unions. I'm a scientist. That's where I come from. I would love the English and the Scots to be sort of in lockstep on this. But at the moment, I can quite understand their frustration because they're getting pushed into places that they, as a country, never wanted to go. Brexit is one of them, but associated with Brexit are the consequences of Brexit for their own decision-making. Like, for example, trade deals with New Zealand. They don't get a veto over that. They haven't been given a veto over that, even though it impacts their farming. If they were an independent nation within the EU, they would. Even regions like Wallonia got a veto over it. And so you could argue that's a better working team. And there have been many other instances where the Scots have never voted in Tory governments, but they're having all these conservative policies pushed on them. You know, England's will is being ridden over Scotland. So, I mean, like I say, you know, unions, I believe in them when it's productive economically, when it's productive culturally, when everyone's got a fair say in it. And I think at the moment, Scotland's in a hell of a position. And I am not fearful of referendums. I think perhaps we should do more referendums. I think it's
love them.
Oh, I disagree.
useful. But it's a useful part of the toolkit. And, you know, people always say, this is the thing that kills referendums. This is it. This decision is for keeps. This is forever.
It should be advisory.
Everything hangs on this. Rather than life is long, history is long. As a country, we're free to experiment in clubs, out clubs, apart, together.
Mike, my concern with referendums is those with deep pockets, Richard, you'll know this, can influence reach and opinion, for example, when it comes to things like referendums. And this is where I think when we saw this with Brexit, we said there's a lot of money that was being pumped into Leave.uk, Vote Leave, and they can flood Facebook, for example, with all of their marketing. And this is where I think referendums can get very dangerous because,
let's be clear, the Remain side spent a lot more on that referendum than the Leave side. Look, it's all about the regulation from the Electoral Commission, and there are countries like Switzerland that have loads of referendums that I think is great, and actually also in the US, and I'm a fan of referendums. And on Scotland, look, a generation to me is 25 years, so you could argue it's 20, but that's about a generation. I think the idea that it's 8 or 9 years,
but who
I think is too short.
Richard?
But that's what they said. That's what they said. They said a generation is a generation.
When we voted for Brexit, we did not ask for permission from the European Union. Is it okay that we have a vote?
We didn't need to ask for permission. We're a sovereign nation.
So then why?
When Scotland voted, yes, but when
we need to ask permission from the English for
because when they voted for when they had a referendum in 2014, it was agreed amongst the Scottish different camps that it was a vote for a generation. And they did it in the knowledge that there would be a Brexit referendum vote within a few years. Look, I'm a unionist.
They were told to vote to stay within the union on the basis that they would be kept in the EU.
Yeah.
Cameron promised this. The Vote No to Independence campaign promised this, and they were dragged out against their will. 62% of Scottish voters. And look, if you think about the Scottish, by the way, I need to point out the hypocrisy of a UK government hell-bent on sovereignty, wanting to leave the European Union, denying Scotland the ability to leave a union.
Absolutely.
And they have been
They haven't
lied
said
to.
never. They said a generation is a generation.
But you said what a generation. No, when they've seen
otherwise,
the
you're
broken
going to end it up every 5 years.
This is the thing. Marina's absolutely right. Scottish people were fed so many broken promises. And I think actually the political landscape and actually the landscape of the UK has changed so much since 2014. Now, as a Scot, in 2014, I didn't vote, but I would have voted for us to stay within the Union. Now, I would, without a shadow of a doubt, vote for us to leave the United Kingdom. Now, I think Nicola Sturgeon, she has made her mistakes, but she is strong on her mandate of trying to deliver Scottish independence. That's what the SNP is built on. And we also have to remember the SNP, for want of a better word, have a chokehold over Scotland. They rule Scotland up and down. And I remember when Scotland was Labour stronghold. And it switched completely to SNP stronghold. She is delivering the mandate of the party, which is for an independent Scotland. Now, I think that 2023 is slightly too soon. I think if she waited to 2024, then she will get the mandate that she wants. I'm not sure if she will in 2023.
Well, maybe.
But I do think also so much has happened with the pandemic, with also the state of the Tory government, which we can all agree on. Boris Johnson and his
the union's been here. I'm a unionist.
Made a mockery of government. And I think Scottish people are fed up of being associated with the government.
You don't bail out of a 300-year union because of a 2-year pandemic.
No, that rules over them in a way that it doesn't work for them. And yes, they do have rules that the SNP make in Scotland, but still they are under this Tory government. Now, yes, a pandemic is, a once in every 100, 300, 400-year event, but it's been a huge event that's had a massive impact.
And Scotland's health service handled it worse than the rest of the UK. Their death rates are worse than the rest of the UK. So they can't exactly hold themselves up.
No, perhaps this is an opportunity for them to take
when you get to a generation
of things like that.
Look, when you have another referendum, maybe the lesson to learn from the previous one is that the withdrawal agreement should be negotiated ahead of the referendum so that people can't say you didn't know what you voted for. And that'll be an interesting negotiation.
They did not plan contingencies because technically it was an advisory referendum. Technically, you couldn't go and treat it then like an advisory referendum. But because of that, they didn't actually say, so what happens in the circumstances whereby England votes to leave and Scotland votes to remain? So it was because of that dynamic that then that left the open question after the vote went through, and they said, yeah, technically it was advisory, but of course we're going to go through with this, right?
Because that's democracy.
Yes. but it wasn't well planned and well structured as to how you handle the different contingencies, because Vote Leave never put on the table a plan of different contingencies. We were asking them again and again. I kept thinking during the referendum debate, any day now, they're actually going to have to put on the table what their actual plan is. And then...
So you're agreeing with me, put the plan out up front, negotiate the withdrawal agreement up front, and then everybody knows what they're voting for, and that would be a good thing. But I just feel that a generation is 20 to 25 years, it's not 9 years. That's...
If you had been lied to like they have been lied to, they were promised A and they've been given Z. Like they have been told so many things.
They've been given lots of promises by Nicola Sturgeon that haven't turned out to be correct.
Such a relatively low power share. It's a massive democratic deficit.
They've got the Barnett formula, which gives them about a 20% increase in terms of funding, which I don't regret at all, actually. I mean, I'm a massive unionist, but I'm also devolution.
We're talking about policy decisions.
I would devolve much more power to all of the four regions, so that individual nations can run much more.
But you say
much more of a sort of a federated structure,
which gives them. And my fundamental thing about, like, you're an Englishman, I'm an Englishman. I don't think we've got rights over them and to patronise them and say it has to be 25 years because we made you agree that before, or we made your parents agree that before, so you have to be held to that now.
Yeah,
it is actually openly, freely their choice as a people. I would love for them to stay alongside us, but I fully understand, and you probably understand too, if you've got a Conservative Party that looks to continually dominate with such not only corrupt behaviour, but also giving them such lack of freedom in their own choices, you can see where this is going to go.
The way through it is actually proportional representation, because then you are not dominated by a Conservative Party, which has been the main beneficiary of first past the post.
So your plea then would be, hold off a little longer, because if we get proportional representation... then we'll break a lot of your problems.
And I would devolve a lot more power from Westminster.
That's something I could agree to.
Apart from military and foreign power, individual nations should be much more responsible. For example, Scotland can have a completely different immigration policy from England. That's completely possible, but at the moment is not done. And those are the sort of things where actually I think more devolved power to the individual nations would be a really good thing. I love pushing power as close as possible to the people.
So that's something I can agree with, and I like that if Scotland would have its own immigration policy, whereby it could also then potentially have Erasmus again, go back and have a free movement relationship with the EU for the Scottish people. I mean, that opens up things, because then you're talking about a Scottish passport, which then has more rights than an English passport.
Exactly.
But as a principle, I like opening these kind of discussions.
You can do all of that stuff. For me, though, the absolute red line is the nuclear deterrent and military protection. That's my main red line.
Okay.
We will finish today's programme on Richard's red line. That's all we have time for today. What did you think? Did any of our panellists manage to change your mind? Let us know in the comments below, and let us know what you'd like to see on the table next week by becoming a member at Byline TV Plus and getting involved. Just go to byline.tv/join to become a member and get access to loads of exclusive perks, like the ability to decide topics for the table, live Q&As, and extended and behind-the-scenes content. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.